you can see if there's a difference between people's responses.
Thanks for taking my
Screen with them.
Just so much on my computer.
When it gets longer.
Yeah. And we're good to go whenever you're.
Good.
Yep. Yeah.
The glasses off. Let's see. Morning, everybody, and welcome to, I'm not sure, what's this, fourth or fifth? So we have a speaker today who I'm going to let her pronounce her name, Dr.
Dita, or Dr. K.
All right, very good. Thank you for saving me. She is an assistant professor of natural resource assistant professor of natural resources economics policy at the University of Florida School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences. Much of her research explores how people value, interact with many types of coastal and forested ecosystems, including studies on restoration projects, springs conservation, and invasive aquatic species management. She has worked on projects that quantify the economic benefits of coastal natural areas in Southwest Florida, assesses social impacts of marine restoration, and evaluate how management policies shape recreation and community well-being. And I mentioned before in the realm of extension, a lot of times we have the science side of things that is relatively isolated, and as H.C. Odom would do, put the blinders on, essentially avoid the human dimension. But the reality is the human dimension is a big factor, and economics are absolutely key to most of that. So looking very forward to their presentation.
Thanks. Yeah. So, hi, I'm very happy to be invited to this. I did my research, so I feel like I'm the first social science human dimensions person, right? Because everything else I didn't really understand. It was like modeling, mapping, using AI. So I was like, oh, maybe I'm the first HD person here. So I'm going to be presenting on a small piece of a huge project called Facets, and Dr. David Kaplan was actually on that project as well. So what I did in this little piece of the project is valuing the Upper Floridan Aquifer. So exploring basically a payment for ecosystem service program to preserve our aquifer system. But the cool part about this project is actually the framing effect and experiments that we did. So how to frame, the issue to garner more support for it. So I figured I would briefly introduce myself. So I think there's a couple of you taking my class, question mark. So yep, hi. So sorry you already know this, but I'm not just a person on a video, I'm a real person. So I actually am a quadruple gator. So I got all three of my degrees at the School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences. And then I now am a professor in the same exact school. I'm kind of getting sick of the building, but whatever. But I did diversify a little bit. So I was an economist for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission while I was finishing my PhD. And that's really where I got into fisheries. Fascinating. And then I also have, so I have a 60% research appointment here, but then I also am responsible for 40% teaching. So what that means is I teach 2 undergrad courses, which some of you are in, 2 graduate courses. And then I also am a program director of a study abroad class in Costa Rica every spring. If you are interested, it's grad and undergrad. Please talk to me because it's super fun. So for my research program, this out of the way. For my research program, so I identify as a social scientist. So social scientist is my umbrella, but then I use economic tools under my umbrella to explain people's behaviors. So I look at not only the psychology, but I look at how people spend their money to let me know what their behaviors are. So I do a lot of socioeconomic impact assessments where I combine social theories with economic theories to basically explain what happens when we change a policy or a natural resource, what happens to the people as well as the natural resource. I do a lot of policy research as well, looking at how policies go together or cohere and how they may oppose each other at different federal, state, and local levels. I do a lot of willingness to pay studies, so this is one of them. Basically looking at non-market values for ecosystem services, so putting a dollar sign on things that don't have a formal market. And then I also do traditional economic valuation, looking at stuff that does have a market for it. And I put this last bullet on because this is the best part of my job. because I'm on transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary teams all the time, often as the only human dimensions economist, social scientist person, I get to kind of dip my feet into all of these different contexts. So I can like pretend to be an ecologist that understands how harmful algal blooms form. I can pretend to understand the full, nitrogen cycle in soil, pretend all of that stuff. But for the most part, right, the economics doesn't change, but the resource might change, and I get to learn all of these different things. So I am a trained forester technically, but then I've also worked in fisheries. I do outdoor recreation research just because I love it. It's a passion of mine. And then I do things like with working land, so traditional agricultural systems, cow-calf operations. And then I'm also getting into the field of biosolids and wastewater, which never thought I would ever do, but I'm in a Water Institute cohort, researching ways to move our biosolids in a better way. So that's just a little bit about me. And today I try to do something fun in every single one of my lectures, and I thought this would be fun, but it didn't turn out that great. And I used AI for the first time to make a photo, and it took a long time. It kept messing it up. So it's not what I wanted, but it's what we get. So today we're going to be building a cake. So we're going to go through these layers from bottom to top, obviously talking about what our research context is, what are framing effects, what are moral foundations, the methods we won't really focus on because it's boring, and just kind of like a lot, but then the results, and of course the implications of the results, right? Why does this all matter? So is anyone not familiar with our Upper Floridan Aquifer? It's okay if you aren't. Wonderful. So I don't have to go into detail because I don't really know all of the technical terms about how the aquifer works, but this is a unique and amazing resource, right? Because it spans 5 states technically, with the majority of our Floridan aquifer in this North Florida, Southern Georgia region. And what's important here, and why I included this schematic, is the unconfined layer, right? So this darker blue for those that can't see the colors as well. So the unconfined means that the water is more accessible, but it's also more prone to pollutants, right? Specifically nitrogen. And if I could put another layer here on this map for agricultural producers, we would see that there's a big concentration of agricultural producers right on top of that unconfined layer, which poses a problem, right? Because we know that agricultural producers are, can contribute to runoff. Not saying that they're the largest contributors of pollutants in the area, right? Like we have to think about septic tank systems and things like that. But this is just a problem that we were analyzing in the scope of this facets project. I'm giving you a little brain break here. So these are some of my favorite springs, but I've never been to Silver Springs because I heard it gets very crowded. Has anyone been there? Is it crowded?
Depends on.
Good.
Okay. So, okay. Maybe I'll go visit. I deserve to, but my favorite is Itchinatuckney, definitely. Okay, brain break over. So the aquifer gives us fresh water, right? Provides fresh water for like 10 million plus people, especially in North Florida. It provides water for our agricultural industry. It provides water for our recreation industry around the springs. So there's several competing uses here, right? And there's threats to the aquifer. So I did mention that unconfined layer with producers in it as well, but there's also the threat of there's a lot of people moving to Florida still. How do we meet that demand of fresh water, agriculture, etc., while keeping our UFA pretty pristine? There's a lot of potential solutions, and as academics, right, we always try to proactively come at the problem. So one potential solution that we thought about during this project was improving our use of agricultural best management practices. So for those that might be unfamiliar, for BMPs, we're talking specifically in this context about practices that reduce water use and water quality impacts while also maintaining that agricultural soil, right? We still want to keep production going. And in Florida, this is not the case elsewhere, but in Florida, we have required BMPs. So in order for producers to put their product to market, they have to meet these best management practices, and they are monitored, etc. But then there's also these voluntary BMPs that they're not required to do, but they can if they want. So these voluntary BMPs can kind of be expensive though. So they can require, new technology adaptation. They can require different practices that might alter their yields. So you might be kind of saying, you know, like Dr. K, why would anybody do this voluntary BMP if it seems kind of like a risk and a really big investment? So then we were like, okay, well, what if we actually pay the producers in this unconfined layer to adopt these voluntary best management practices that actually, you know, help the Floridan aquifer? So cool, right? But we have to make sure that the producers are actually on board. If we offered a kind of program, would the producers, especially in this area, do that? So that was our first question, and thankfully I didn't have to do that. I had a colleague that did an entire study on this. So he basically found, and obviously this is not, you know, his whole project, but he found that producers are willing to adopt these BMPs if there were incentives. So that's great. So now we are starting a payment for ecosystem service program, and this is kind of our guideline, right? We're incentivizing these producers to implement these voluntary BMPs to improve the ecosystem services around the Upper Floridan Aquifer. So this sounds really great, right? And you might be like, okay, so it seems like, why don't we do this across every natural resource? Why don't we give every producer all of these incentives to, like, you know, minimize their impacts? Well, it's because funding is a huge barrier for payment for ecosystem services. So Florida has several successful PES programs. I think the most successful one is the Northern Everglades Water Storage PES program. So the South Florida Water Management District actually pays large scale landowners to store water to reduce flood impacts, among other things. And it's been going on for, I think, 12 years now. They finished their pilot and they got more money for it. So it does work. And we do have new PES programs, like for the Florida Panther Habitat with FWC, they have a new one. So it does work. But when we talk about funding, it's where to get the funding, and the longevity of funds. So yes, we could get funding from the state government, from a local government, etc. But then the longevity of funds is always the question. So a lot of the times in PES contracts, there are 10-year increments. So within that 10 years, you know, if it's funded from the state, for example, usually that funding comes from like a separate general pot for natural resource management. So that pot could go away. There's a huge invasive species outbreak, or they have to fight a fire elsewhere, for example. So source of funding and longevity of funds is definitely hard. So we were kind of thinking, okay, so we can't, how do we, you know, get a nice incentive pile to actually make this PES program work? So we were thinking we could just ask the public, you know, what they would want to do, and if they would be willing to support this kind of a program through, you know, utility taxes, donations. We would explore a whole different litany of, you know, how to actually get these funds. Okay, so now we're moving on to the framing effects. So we understand that we're working within the Upper Floridan Aquifer, we're creating a payment for ecosystem service program. But now we want to know, how do we actually frame it in a way that garners more support? So framing effects is a kind of body of research. I don't know if it's technically a body, but like a subgroup of research that has really garnered a lot of attention lately. So environmental policies are generally polarizing, right? Given the data from the last, I don't know, like 50, 40 years, right? We know that a lot of the times when we're talking about our two-party system, you know, environmental policies really haven't changed since the 70s, right? Our big, massive environmental acts are pretty much the same as when they were. We do have a few new acts that were created in the last decade, but for the most part, you know, our sole big environmental policies haven't changed. And so framing effects have been linked to political identification, because what you're doing here is you're basically changing what you're focusing on in your messaging without changing any of the facts. So the outcome and the goals are the same, but you're kind of just emphasizing certain words or points more than others. And, you know, based on literature and data, we know that, you know, people that are liberal, that identify as liberal, democratic, left-leaning, I use those terms ubiquitously here, are more likely to support environmental legislation versus those that identify as conservative, right-leaning, and things like that. So that's kind of the basis of using a framing effect here. And there's this very famous study back in, I think it was 15 years ago, that kind of started the movement to investigating environmental policies in terms of frames and political identification, where they found that there was bipartisan support of environmental policies if they were framed in a way that preserved American traditions. And we'll talk about a little bit what that is in a second. So just to frame where we are and who we sampled, so it was a survey to get to these things, right? To get to the public and ask them what they were willing to pay and do all the framing effective experiments. So this is the context that we're grabbing our sample from. So this is the results of the last presidential election. So Florida was definitely more conservative and right-leaning versus Georgia was split a little bit more. But still the outcome was the same. So also just caveat, these, districts and counties are not proportionate to population, but this is what we're doing with. So we want to understand how can we remove the polarization from this PES program to garner more support, irrespective of political identity. So now you have a good background of framing effects. So now we can talk about what frames we actually pick, right? We can't just pick things out of nothing. We have to have things based in theory. So this is where my super smart colleague, Dr. Sadie Hundemer, she's an expert at this, I am not, suggested to use Haidt's moral foundations theory to build our frames. So basically, very simply put, because obviously it's more complicated than this, it just says that our moral reasoning and how we make decisions is based through our individual cultures and experiences, right? So if my culture and experiences are different than Dr. Clark's, than yours, right? Makes sense. And they came up with 5 general bins where people usually land, in terms of moral reasoning. So care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. But we didn't want to do all of that because that's a lot of work, to be honest. So we just picked a couple based on the literature, again, that were representative of conservative ideals and liberal ideals generally. Of course, we're making blanket statements here. So for conservative leaning folks, we chose loyalty. So you can look at key emotions is group pride. The virtues are things like loyalty, patriotism, self-sacrifice. And then fairness, we're more for democratic or liberal leaning. So we're talking about fairness, justice, trustworthiness. So these were supposed to be proxies to garner more support for these individual political identities. Okay. There were a lot of research questions within this project, but we're focusing today on these 2 based on our little cake. So we want to even know if this incentive program, irrespective of the frames, is viable, right? Will this even work in general? And then can we put value frames in there that actually impact people's willingness to pay for the whole program and the specific attributes? Going into our methods, which again, so our methods, the way we get to the willingness to pay is through something called a discrete choice experiment. So when participants take the survey, they get 4 of these tables that are randomized. It's very confusing because this is actually from a different project, so these aren't the technical attributes, but I'm just trying to explain what it looks like and how we actually calculate people's willingness to pay. So over here, we have our attributes. So these are our ecosystem services that we're focused on, but you'll notice that there's something called a one-time tax up there. So usually when you want to calculate a monetary willingness to pay, you don't always have to. You include something like a tax or like a utility payment or a donation or something like that. So you can calculate, the actual willingness to pay. And then you have your alternatives. So option A, B, and C in this case, and you can have more, you can have less. And then you'll see that option A and B have varying what we call levels. So these things are randomized. And then you see that option C is just this weird word called opt-out. So that's just like, I don't want anything to do with the program. I either don't believe in it or I don't have the money for it, whatever. We're just trying to mimic like a real life scenario. You don't want to do it, you don't want to do it. So that's how we actually calculate the willingness to pay. And so to actually get to what the exact ecosystem services were, as well as the payment vehicle, I did a lot of focus groups, interviews with people, experts. It took a very long time to get this table, so it doesn't look like a lot, but this was the longest process. So we decided to represent the payment vehicle as an annual property tax to Florida and Georgia residents. The ecosystem services that were important were outdoor recreation that the UFA provides, environmental health for flora and fauna, specifically water quantity, so ensuring water for future generations, and then the economic impact. This is kind of a weird one because it's not technically an ecosystem service, but it was so important to people during our focus groups that we couldn't leave it out. And then this is what the actual frames looked like. So people were put into these quasi-experimental groups. So we obviously had a control group where people were not given any of this, but then we put people in randomly in loyalty and fairness groups as well within the survey. So take a look at some of the language for loyalty, right? We're talking about our state government is enlisting all Florida residents. Water is one of the many things that unite Floridians, right? We benefit with improved health and a strong economy, asking taxpayers to pool their resources for the common good. And then this last sentence, right? Any small sacrifice is a pledge of allegiance with our Florida brothers and sisters, right? So really kind of getting that group mentality going. Versus fairness, we're talking about, you know, equitably compensating farmers for investing their time and money. Florida waters are overused and polluted because of everybody, so it's only fair that we contribute our share to help farmers protect the water that grows our food and enables our quality of life. So very different, you know, this is just like trying to be equitable and fair and compensate the farmers that are going out of their way to, you know, give us food. Okay, I lied. This is still more of the methods. So this is just showing you that we had a total survey of 3,100 people, and then the exact number of people that were split in the groups. And then we did what was called a PO test to actually explore the statistically significant differences between the different groups. So we wanted to like make sure that we're just not making up, you know, these statistically significant differences. For those that are familiar with parametric versus non-parametric testing, it's non-parametric, it's kind of similar to like a Tukey test, like a post hoc test. If you don't care about this, it's okay. I just wanted to make sure that you knew that these differences were legitimate. Okay, so now getting into our results. So this very, very boring beep-boop-bop table with a lot of numbers is our general willingness to pay. So is this general program with all of these ecosystem services, is the general public willing to pay for it? And the answer here, although you can't really interpret it probably, is yes, because of this value. So this opt-out value, so remember option C, where people didn't want to be in the program, is negative and statistically significant. So people were more likely to choose option A and B, which represented the program, than opting out of the program. And then for our ecosystem services, when we convert that to the mean willingness to pay, we can see that by far, right, the people were the most willing to pay for positive economic impacts, followed by water quantity, then recreation, so there's direct and indirect, and then improved environmental health would last. So this is specifically for flora and fauna. And then this is our comparison of the framing experiment. And again, I am just going to summarize it for you. I recently learned, I feel like I'm very slow with all of like the new terminologies, so too long don't read. I love that. I'm gonna use that in every single presentation. So basically what we're seeing with our framing experiment, and this is comparing the two frames to the control group only, is that for our control group, we had higher individual ecosystem service values. So when you look at the actual ecosystem service values, they're higher than most. Even the coefficients are mostly higher than the other two groups. However, the caveat is that when you actually calculate the monetary value of willingness to pay, it is very sensitive to how sensitive the folks are to the tax. So you'll see that they are a little bit more sensitive to the tax if they're put into the group, and we'll talk about the implications of that later. So if the tax goes up, they're less willing to pay compared to the control group. So what we see is for the control group, right, that there generally are higher individual ecosystem service values, but there's the highest for environmental health and recreation. For the fairness group, they are actually most likely to opt into the program, again, because of this coefficient right here, right? It's negative and statistically significant, although weaker, but we can still see that people that are put in a fairness group are more likely to opt into the program, although their individual willingness to pay scores are still a little bit less. And what's interesting is that they are focused more on water, so that increasing water quantity. So we can see that they do have the highest coefficient. Again, the way this dollar sign is calculated is a little bit, tricky because of the tax, but when we look at the strength of the coefficient, that's telling us that they're very interested in increasing water quantity. Again, this is me postulating based on what I know in my experience in the literature, but water is a shared public good, so it kind of makes sense that people resonate with like being, equality and fairness when sharing a water resource. And then for loyalty, they were kind of all over the place. They were, definitely leaning harder into jobs and recreation. And then this was kind of weird to me, and I wanted to do a lot more testing after this, is they actually valued environmental health more so than the fairness component, which was actually strange to me because I would have thought vice versa. And, maybe jobs or positive economic impacts, recreation, that kind of to me resonates more with community and tradition. So maybe that is really, coming towards that loyalty perspective. Okay, so why does all of this matter? So our first research question was, would this program even work, right? Irrespective of the frames, do people want this? And our answer was yes, thankfully, because that would have been a very short presentation if they said no. Because of that opt-out option, right? We talked about that it was negative and it was statistically significant. I don't know why that says not, sorry. And we had positive and significant attributes across all of the ecosystem services. So yay, great. But this is the most interesting part of this research, right? Is the value frames. So we can tell that both frames actually help the public opt into the program. Yes, I will go back because the loyalty frame technically was not statistically significant, but it was negative. So maybe from a practical standpoint, we can argue it, although, statistically we can't. We saw that fairness did technically decrease opting out of the program the most, and then it increased support the most for water quantity. So that's a really cool insight, right? To maybe frame this program in a way that uses that fairness language, but really focuses on water quantity alone as the benefactor of the program. And that raises this bigger question that, kind of plagues economists that are in this field is reducing opt-out rates more important than the individual attribute values, right? So this is kind of like the practical versus like the research side, right? Like I investigated a lot of different ecosystem services and their individual values, but when this payment for ecosystem service program is actually implemented, you don't see that, right? You don't see the intricate little values that I calculated from a survey. You see, would you pay into this program or not? So there's a big body of research though, and this could be a whole separate study in and of itself, how these moral frames actually elicit more realistic willingness to pay values. So maybe that's why we were seeing back here, lower values across the board for fairness and loyalty because you're tugging at people's heartstrings, you're speaking their language, and maybe they're more invested and they're like, okay, well, I really want this to happen, but realistically, right, I only make $20,000 a year, I can't put that much money in, but if this really happened, like this is what I would do. Versus maybe people in the control group, they kind of take it as, which is a bias technically, but they take it as, okay, this is kind of like a fake program, it's really not gonna happen, maybe I'll just throw this X amount of money, it's not like it's gonna happen, right? Which is a very real thing that we have to deal with in this type of method. And so within our groups that we investigated, right, the control, the fairness, and the loyalty, we had fairly equal amounts of people that identified as Republican, Democrat, or Independent. And across that, we saw that the fairness kind of moved the needle with everybody. So it moved the needle for people to opt into the program. And this kind of supports other literature that finds that liberal messaging can influence conservative attitudes and vice versa. There are certain natural resources, there's certain contexts and certain situations where the reverse is true, which complicates everything, but it's very cool to me. And then finally, right, we can pinpoint language to use for things like ballot measures. I mean, I hope you all vote and I hope you read the amendments and all of that kind of stuff. And just that in that small little paragraph that you get to read about something, using the appropriate language is really important, especially for natural resource conservation, to again make it, non-polarizing. And for state government, it's also important when we present these kinds of information to them to make sure that we're messaging in a way that kind of packs a punch, that gets, that shows that, hey, we're all on the same team. We need to, move the needle with natural resource policies and conservation, so this is kind of a double-edged sword here. We can garner support in a way that is, good towards the state government. So I wanted to present a lot more research, but I didn't get it done in time because fall semester is a doozy for me. But this study basically inspired me to do this next study that I'm working with Alachua County on a grant. So they wanted to actually investigate if ecological or economic frames, so either focusing on ecological benefits of management or economic benefits of management, were more important to the public who use the springs when they're thinking about management strategies and scenarios. So I am working on another framing experiment in the springs, but it's definitely like more focused on the actual management of the springs. And I can't talk for 45 minutes, so that's all I have for today.
Questions in the room?
Hi, I was wondering, how did you choose participants for, like, the voting?
Yeah, sure. So for the survey, we used a Qualtrics paid panel. So the Qualtrics software, they offer, you can incentivize people. I'm not really quite sure where they get they have like a knowledge panel where they pull people from.
Okay.
So we just made sure that we calculated who the general Florida and Georgia audience was based on the 2022 at that time American Community Survey. We were like, this is the percentage of race, ethnicity, education, etc. that we need for the sample. So they kind of did that for us.
Okay.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
Just as a follow-up on that, what was the regional extent? Was it all of the Floridan Aquifer?
Yeah.
Or
It was talking more about like the UFA, so it definitely highlighted just like the upper,
okay,
so the unconfined region more, but we weren't really specific. We kept it general with the aquifer general. We pointed out some key areas, like some of the springs that they might have visited or something like that. But we tried to describe the aquifer as a whole and then give like little vignettes of like, this is what it looks like when it comes to the surface.
was there any understanding of how far away they could have been from the spring, like how much they were relating to perhaps the recreational value of
Yeah.
the spring?
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah, we asked them if they had ever visited a spring. That was a survey question, and then we also did just basic like regression covariates within the willingness to pay study to see if people's location affected at all, and it was not statistically significant. So it didn't really matter with either the recreation question or their location, which was shocking to me. Yeah.
So this was over like a very large scale, it seems like. Well, so how would you like scale this down for like individual communities and how they're going to like vote, especially if they're living maybe not in the unconfined section and they're living in like a more confined section?
Yeah, that's totally super valid. So this was a really, really exploratory study. Like we wanted just to kind of like get feelers around the room, right? And you're totally right. Like, why would someone from Atlanta, Georgia care about a spring in High Springs, right? So I think moving forward, it would be interesting to like actually look deeper and dive deeper, like region to region, because this was like statewide. So I think it would be really interesting to like go deeper and ask about like community values and things like that, and directly link them to, because I mean, obviously people that live in the unconfined layer, right, where more spring systems are, they have more culture and connection to the springs. So we definitely see that. And maybe our sample here was too big, like I just said to Dr. Clark, like it wasn't statistically significant. And maybe it's because that's more of a rural audience that Qualtrics has a hard time capturing. So maybe that was, that little difference that we could have done a little bit better in. But getting to rural communities is harder. But it's definitely how we would actually implement this if it were to be implemented, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
From my understanding, you used the text like with fairness and loyalty, and you gave that to survey respondents before they answered the survey. So for the control, did you use any specific text for that, or was it just like you gave them the survey directly? How did that work?
Yeah, so everybody got like the same intro questions to like what the aquifer was and things like that. And then for the control group, we just had like very basic boilerplate like language. That was actually also included with the loyalty and fairness group. So it was basically like, this is, you know, a hypothetical program where we're exploring different ecosystem services that the aquifer provides. Please answer to the best of your ability. It was kind of like that general statement. And then the people put in the loyalty and fairness group underneath also got these paragraphs. And we did like timing checks to make sure that they, and attention checks to make sure that they were actually reading them, you know, so they weren't just like flipping through. So yeah.
Did you, probably not you specifically, but maybe somebody else on the team, with the amount of money that, you know, people are potentially willing to pay, that money generated by total population, relative to the cost of implementing some of these, are they matching up, or are we like way off still in the sense of, are we generating more money relative to the cost of implementing these kind of optional EMPs, or are we the other way around?
I actually don't know about the BMP side of it, but you know, if we were to look at just even the general willingness to pay values, you can't like combine these, right, to get like a whole program, value. So like if we just took this 129 and then like multiplied it by Florida and Georgia residents, that's like an astronomical number. So we could do like different sensitivity analysis to like understand, okay, if we like made a program just for Florida or North Florida, what would that look like in terms of multiplying that by the residents, and like how much money would that be? I'm not sure about the BMP side though, because that was more Anish who did the producer side of things, but that's a great question.
Well, I mean, it just seems like, are we in the same ballpark?
Yeah,
I mean,
like
I
what's the ROI basically, yeah.
I mean, it'd be interesting too, because I mean, down the, you mentioned the dispersed water storage program, I was
Yeah.
involved in that on the front end, but. Yeah, that kind of is money that's going, if people are paying in taxes,
Yeah.
routing it through the water management district, so. I don't know that they know they're actually
Yeah,
contributing to that,
for
and
sure,
it's up
yeah.
to the water management district to determine how that money is distributed, so in some respects. You know, if somehow the water management district raised their taxes by a certain millage rate, I mean, you might still get to the same end goal, but most people wouldn't even know it happened,
Exactly, yep,
so.
Yep.
Just differences in willingness to pay.
Yeah.
Anybody else, anything online?
No.
No.
good questions, guys.
All right,
Cool.
well, it was great, another round of applause, please. Thanks, everybody.